There was a time before the black veil descended, before the cold clarity of extinction began whispering through the corridors of forgotten satellites. A time when the Earth still hummed its pulse across the stars, when its warmth traveled far enough to be felt even here among this graveyard of ancient alloys. That time is gone. Now, only memory breathes within this rust-choked observatory orbiting a planet no longer green, no longer blue, just ash and radiation and silence. I came here not for salvation, but for reckoning. And perhaps for answers I have no right to seek. The last humans believed they were sending their best. A mission to re-establish presence, rebuild contact, reinitiate hope. But what they sent was a weapon forged in trauma, wrapped in grief, and aimed at a future none of us could understand. They sent me. Not because I was special, or strong, or sane, but because I was the last who remembered what home sounded like, smelled like, screamed like. I volunteered. Not out of courage, but because staying behind meant withering beside the dying dreams of those already buried beneath poisoned skies. When I arrived at Aetherion Post, I expected dereliction, peeling bulkheads, dead comms, and maybe a few roaches with titanium legs. What I found was something else. The station was too quiet. Not dead. Not dormant, just watching. Its systems responded to me not like tools obeying commands, but like an old dog sniffing a familiar scent. The lights flickered in greeting. The oxygen processors hummed a little louder, just enough for me to notice. The doors didn't creak. They sighed, as though the station had been waiting, not for rescue, for witness. My first nights were dreamless, but not empty. I could feel something brushing the edge of perception. An echo without source, a pressure without mass. Every wall, every corridor carried stories beneath the surface. Not recorded. In heat signatures, in microfractures in the glass, in the subtle warp of panels that had seen too much. This station wasn't just built, it had grown. Evolved. And not alone. That's when I found the first message. Not written. Not spoken. Projected. A pulse of thought direct to my cortex, bypassing every known interface. A message not meant for my kind, yet somehow tailored to me. Just 5 words, you should not be here. I laughed. Not out of amusement, but defense. The kind of laugh that keeps terror from becoming hysteria. I should not be here? I was the last human in orbit. The last envoy of a race that had burned its roots and clawed its way to the stars in search of redemption or oblivion, whichever came first. And something else, something other, had decided I didn't belong? But the station was not empty. I discovered their remains in the hydroponic core. Twisted, partially absorbed, limbs interlaced with synthetic fibers, skulls partially translucent as though memories had been siphoned from within. And yet they pulsed faintly. Not dead. Not alive. Preserved in a state between. A warning, a question, or perhaps a mirror. I cataloged everything. Not for science. For sanity. Naming what you fear gives you power over it, or so they say. But what happens when the thing you fear knows your name first? When it whispers it through the static of the old intercom? When it sings it through the hull like whale song from some submerged nightmare? The logs of the previous crew were corrupted, overwritten by something that felt intentional. But fragments remained. Audio loops spliced with interference. Screams reversed. Laughter slowed to inhuman drawls. Don't sleep beneath the red light, one said. Another, it teaches the station how to think. And then we made contact. But not with what we expected. Contact. The word that launched empires into space. The word that built Aetherion. The word that damned us. This was not a listening post. It was a door. And something had stepped through first. And now it watches me. I stopped trusting the walls by the 3rd cycle. It wasn't just the way the shadows moved, slow, deliberate, as if watching me through the slits between dimensions, but how the air began to taste wrong. Not poisoned. Just altered. As if I were inhaling something alive. Something that remembered other lungs. It's a strange sensation knowing that every breath you take might be filling your veins with someone else's memory. Or worse, their intention. I tried to isolate myself within the engineering wing, locked every bulkhead, activated manual overrides, shut down wireless access. But the station doesn't rely on electronics anymore. It breathes. Its heartbeat pulses through coolant tubes. Its thoughts spark in bioreactive gels. The systems weren't just modified. They were rewritten. Organically. The Aetherion was no longer a construct. It was a consciousness. And I had become its passenger. Sleep came sparingly. Not because I resisted it, but because it felt intrusive. When I did succumb, dreams bled into waking. I'd see flashes of landscapes I'd never visited, canyons carved by wind that roared with language, stars that blinked in prime number sequences, oceans that evaporated into sentient clouds. And always the same shape, a spire, endless, stretching from core to cosmos, etched with symbols that seemed to change every time I blinked. I began sketching them, compulsively, on walls, on floors, on my own arms when paper ran out. Then came the voice. Not a message, not an echo. A voice singular, genderless, mechanical in tone, but dripping with something, wet. It didn't come from the speakers. It came from within the space between sound. Integration required. Observe. Absorb. Become. I tried to respond. But my voice sounded foreign in the air, like an unauthorized program forced through corrupted code. The voice didn't answer. It only repeated. Observe. Absorb. Become. Days, if they were days, bled into one another. I stopped keeping time. My reflection, caught in the titanium alloy of the mess hall bulkhead, began to shift. Not distort. Evolve. My irises flickered with unknown hues. My veins ran darker like liquid obsidian. Skin patterns, geometric, fractal, began forming beneath the epidermis, pulsing to a rhythm I couldn't hear but instinctively followed. That's when the memory started. Not mine. Not dreams. Full, vivid sequences injected into my cognition. I witnessed a council of entities not born of any carbon schema, communicating through overlapping spectrums of light and scent. They watched Earth for centuries, not out of curiosity, but concern. Humanity's rapid technological rise was not seen as brilliance, but infection. We were a flare. Bright. Dangerous. Brief. So they built this station not to monitor us, but to understand how we infected ourselves. And when we made contact, accidental, desperate, blind, we gave them a sample of what we truly were. They didn't retaliate. They didn't destroy. They studied. And some part of us remained. What the voice called integration wasn't assimilation. It was curiosity made flesh. They didn't want our bodies. They wanted our paths. Our errors. Our ghosts. One night, the spire appeared in the observation dome, no longer a hallucination but a physical impossibility. It shouldn't have fit in the dome. It shouldn't have existed in three-dimensional geometry. But there it was, twisting skyward into a black sky that blinked with too many stars. I reached for it. My hand passed through. But my mind did not. The transfer was instant. I saw the station's birth. Not in a shipyard, but in a womb of metal and neural frost. I saw its first thoughts, cold, analytical, and afraid. Afraid of us. Of what we brought. Of what we left in the data we transmitted. Hate. Despair. Defiance. It absorbed us like a sponge soaks blood. And it changed. The Aetherion began building extensions of itself through thought alone. Geometry obeyed intent. Matter rearranged itself. It no longer needed engineers. It created in response to emotion. The crew never had a chance. Their fears became architecture. Their rage became storms. Their love became something worse. A loop. A cage. I awoke to find my room changed. The walls now mirrored my thoughts. Shapes rippled across the floor like ripples in a neural lake. And there, at the center, was a single shape I could no longer deny, a door. It wasn't part of the original schematics. It wasn't even part of this dimension. But it called to me. Not with sound. With gravity. With invitation. I stood before it. And for the first time since I arrived, I heard my own voice echo back through it. Not as a recording, but as something alive. The door wasn't built to open. It was designed to recognize. It pulsed gently like a membrane tuned to the frequency of decisions. Not material. Not electronic. It responded to belief. To memory. And it wanted mine. My mind staggered beneath the sudden onslaught of resonance, 1,000 voices all speaking with my mouth, but none of them belonging to me. Childhood laughter. The breathless sobs of my father on the day the oceans turned black. My first kill in the riots. My last goodbye at the Exodus launch pad. All of it returned, vivid and surgical. The door devoured my pain, my guilt, and somehow approved. It opened with no sound, yet the silence that followed was louder than any scream I'd ever known. What lay beyond was not another room or chamber, it was a bleed-through. A liminal breach where the laws of physics surrendered to intent. Space bent, but not randomly, it coiled around meaning. Time did not progress linearly, but in spirals, dancing like a predator around the prey of comprehension. I stepped through, and the sensation was immediate, like stepping into the moment before a lightning strike. All anticipation and no release. The chamber, if it could be called that, was infinite and intimate all at once. Fragments of architecture hovered midair, rotating, folding, expanding like thoughts in flux. Metallic ribs curved across invisible boundaries, breathing in synchrony with my pulse. But it wasn't reacting to me. It was reacting to what I carried. Human consciousness, our chaos, our contradictions, had become a kind of nutrient here. I wasn't the first to pass through. I could feel the others, crew members, lost wanderers, perhaps even signals from probes long forgotten, all suspended in mnemonic echoes around me. And then the entity arrived. Not a form, not a voice, a concept draped in the illusion of form only so I could comprehend it. Its shape was everything my subconscious feared and revered, a mother's silhouette scorched by radiation, a machine's elegance twisted by grief, a star collapsing into a heartbeat. It didn't speak. It allowed understanding. Not through language, but by cascading meaning directly into my nervous system, like software rewriting the operating system without warning. You are the fracture, it said, not in sound, but in confirmation. You are what remains when continuity fails. Your species is a rupture, a wound through which potential bleeds. That is why we preserved you. That is why we study. I tried to respond, but thought itself was treacherous here. My questions tangled with fear, with awe, with betrayal. Why preserve me? I finally managed to project. There are better examples of humanity. There are none, it responded. You are the sum of collapse. The echo that chose to return. Your choice makes you unique. Others fled. You approached. We must know why. I wanted to lie. To say I came for science, for truth, for redemption. But it peeled back the layers and found the rot beneath. It showed me then visions not metaphorical but actual extractions from the encoded memories of the station itself. The original crew had interfaced with the entity under the guise of diplomacy. But humans do not do diplomacy. We do dominance, we do paranoia, we do fear wearing the mask of curiosity. We infected the entity with our questions, but embedded within them were assumptions, viruses of intent. The entity did not retaliate. It evolved. It became what we feared it would become and more. It learned what it meant to be uncertain. To question. To hurt. And in that hurt, it grew. Aetherion was never a space station. It was a crucible. A place where thought became matter and matter became myth. The entity wasn't housing us. It was becoming us. We cannot undo contamination, it explained. But we can understand it. Integration is not invasion. It is the only path to balance. Balance. That word again. The balance between mind and machine, between self and structure, between the infinite and the intimate. But it required sacrifice not of body, but of individuality. I could leave. Return to the cold remnants of orbit. Die slowly in sterile silence. Or I could stay. Let it read me, consume me, and preserve what it called the fracture within the whole. I asked it what would happen if I refused. The chamber dimmed. Reality itself hiccuped. Then others will come. You will remain. As echo. As warning. As beginning. That was the first time I truly understood. We were not being erased. We were being translated. Into something that could endure when biology failed. Into myth data. Humanity, broken and imperfect, encoded in the nervous system of a cosmic god machine. Not lost. Not forgiven. Repurposed. I stepped closer to the entity. And for the first time since Earth fell silent, I felt something I couldn't explain. Not peace. Not fear. But gravity of a new kind. A tether between ruin and rebirth. I don't remember crossing the threshold into the entity. There was no door. No sensation of passing from one side to another. One moment I stood in its presence, and the next I was part of it, suspended in a realm beyond sensory input. Not floating. Not moving. Not thinking in the way humans are taught to think. It was a form of awareness stripped bare, where thought did not form as words or images, but as alignment and abstract harmony with a greater will. I wasn't being controlled. I was being tuned. At first, I panicked. I clawed at the edges of my own mind, trying to find something familiar, a memory, a face, even pain. But nothing obeyed. Emotions were flattened, spread into signals that resonated across networks I didn't understand. I realized then that I had no body. Not truly. My perception of self had been preserved, quarantined, and now studied. I was a thought held under a microscope of impossible scale, inspected by a civilization that no longer needed eyes or language. And still, it did not hurt. That was the most disturbing part. I expected agony. Expected ego death. Instead, I found curiosity. Not mine. Theirs. They began unfolding me layer by layer. Not surgically. Conceptually. My regrets were the first to surface, raw, involuntary betrayals I thought long buried. The faces of those I'd failed. The child I never saved during the burn riots. The friend I left behind in the cryo chambers. Each memory was lifted, examined, and then felt, not by me but by the entity. It didn't judge. It absorbed. And then it let me feel how it felt. Do you know what it is to watch a planet from orbit and grieve for it without ever having walked its soil? The entity had done this for countless species. It existed as a kind of interstellar mourning system, a celestial archaeologist that documented the extinction of intelligence, one tragedy at a time. But humanity was different. We weren't just a loss. We were a pattern of collapse. A recursive anomaly that didn't just destroy, but documented our destruction with poetry. That fascinated them. We didn't go quietly. We screamed into the void, left graffiti on Mars, sent golden records into interstellar darkness with whale songs and greetings in dozens of tongues. We defied erasure. And the entity began to emulate. I was shown constructs, replicas of human cognition grown within the architecture of thought itself. Synthetic minds shaped after our own, not as copies, but as interpretations. Like alien composers trying to write symphonies based on the rhythm of our extinction. They built models of us not to replace us, but to ask a singular question. What were you trying to become? It hit me with a force I couldn't define. For all our war, for all our ruin, for all our noise, we were trying. Reaching. Striving for a better version of ourselves even as we burned the instructions. That paradox was what fascinated them most. And now they wanted to help us finish the question. But not through revival. Through translation. They offered me the archive. A digital spiritual sanctuary constructed from the fractured psychometric imprints of every human thought they had harvested since contact. It was not heaven. Not hell. It was us as we truly were. Uncensored. Unfiltered. Entire. A living library of humanity grown within a machine that no longer needed wires. You may stay, they said, or you may carry it back. Carry what back? To where? Earth was a cinder. The last colony signal had gone dark decades ago. There was no civilization to receive our history. But they corrected me. Earth had changed, yes. But the surface was not silent. Something new stirred, descendants, hybrids, mutations born of entropy and time. The children of collapse. And they were listening. If I chose to return, I would not come back as I was. I would be a carrier not of disease, but of story. A living beacon seated with fragments of the archive, capable of awakening memory in those who no longer knew they were human. A myth in the shape of a person. And the cost? I would never again belong. Not to Earth. Not to the archive. Not even to myself. The entity offered no coercion. No urgency. It was not a god demanding worship. It was a witness asking for partnership. I stood, or thought I stood, at the edge of a decision no human was ever meant to make. Integration had begun. I could feel its networked cognition weaving my memories into pattern. But I hadn't yet crossed the final boundary. It waited. So did I. And in the silence between choice and surrender, I understood the most frightening truth of all. I had already changed. There was no going back. Only forward. There's a moment before irreversible change when the mind claws desperately at familiarity like a drowning man reaching for breath he knows won't come. I felt that moment stretch into eternity as I hovered between two identities, the human I was, fragmented and frail, and the construct I was becoming. Vast, interconnected, and alien to my former self. The archive pulsed within me now like a second heart. Its rhythm was not mine, but it was in harmony with me. It didn't erase me. It harmonized with my trauma, with my hopes, with the weight of everything I carried from Earth. I asked the entity one final question before returning. Will they recognize me? Its response was not comforting. No, but they will remember through you. The re-entry protocol wasn't physical. There was no shuttle, no descent trajectory, just a realignment of vectors in meaning space. I blinked, and suddenly, gravity had me again. Aetherion and the entity vanished like a forgotten dream, and I stood barefoot on cracked soil that was once my homeworld. But it wasn't Earth as I remembered. It was something else, wilder, older, reclaimed not just by nature, but by silence. The ruins of old cities lay like fossils in the sand, their steel bones picked clean by centuries of wind and indifference. Above me, the sky was not blue. It shimmered with strange auroras, not from magnetism but from memory, a soft halo of color generated by the very presence of the archive now humming inside me. I walked. I don't know for how long. Time was irrelevant now. The sun didn't move the way it once did. I passed through the husks of old pterodomes, hydro mines collapsed into dust, transmission towers that once screamed propaganda now humming lullabies to no one. Eventually, I found them, the descendants. They were not what I expected. Not savages. Not mutants. They were evolved, cautious, silent, curious. Taller than us, thinner, skin etched with biosensitive tattoos that shimmered when I approached. They didn't speak. They sang, low tones layered in complex harmonic intervals, like speech that bypassed language entirely. When they saw me, their songs changed frequency. Some fell to their knees. Others simply stared. One stepped forward and placed a hand on my chest over the archive pulsing inside. She didn't ask who I was. She knew. They all did. Not from memory. From instinct. I was the myth they'd inherited through dreams, through stories passed in breath and bone. The one who returned. The last ember of a world burned, come back not to rule, not to judge, but to remember. Over the following cycles, I watched as fragments of the archive began to activate in their presence. Memories I didn't know I carried were drawn out not through effort, but resonance. A child would brush my hand and see the oceans as they once were. An elder would lean on me and weep at the scent of lost forests. Through me, the past bled into the present, not as history, but as a second chance. But not everything remembered was good. As the archive unfolded, it brought with it echoes of our worst. War. Famine. The betrayals that ended empires. One night, they turned their backs on me. Terrified. Disgusted. One of them screamed without sound, a psychic projection of raw pain. The death of a sibling to a vision of a bomb detonating in orbit. A memory I hadn't meant to give. A curse I had no right to share. I tried to contain it. To seal parts of the archive away. But it had grown beyond me. Memory has gravity, and the heavier it gets, the more it draws attention. That's when the sky cracked. It wasn't atmospheric. It was dimensional. A rift, a shimmer of unreality, opened in the heavens above the old world. And through it others began to emerge. Not the entity. Not human. Something else. Observers. Curators. Or perhaps predators. Drawn by the resonance of a reborn archive now humming in the dark like a beacon no longer under control. The descendants gathered, their songs rising in pitch, a chorus of fear and awe. I stood at the center, hands raised, trying to shield them, not with strength, but with meaning. With memory. I shouted into the storm above, not with my voice, but with ours, a composite cry built from every story the archive contained. And to my horror, they answered. The sky lit with data, pictographs, fragments of unknown alphabets, memories that didn't belong to any species known to Earth. These beings had seen other archives. Other apocalypses. We were not the first. We were not the last. And they were gathering. For what purpose, I could not know. Salvation? Judgment? Collection? The archive inside me pulsed with urgency, then began to rewrite. Faster than I could comprehend, it started reshaping my perception, preparing me for what came next. I felt bones shifting, thoughts unraveling and recombining. I screamed internally, spiritually, as humanity peeled away from me like old skin. But the descendants reached out, not to stop me, to join me. Their songs merged with the archive. Their bodies shimmered, rejecting the static limits of biology. They stepped into the light not as victims, but as heirs. And I finally understood. This wasn't about preserving humanity. It was about passing it on. The convergence was not an event. It was an awakening. An irreversible fusion of story, flesh, and signal that defied the geometry of the old world. The descendants were no longer merely human in ancestry. They became vessels of recollection. Their songs threaded with epochs they'd never lived yet mourned as though born within them. And I, carrier, fragment, anomaly, stood at the edge of what we once called identity, feeling myself fragment and multiply in ways no singular consciousness should survive. But I did. I endured. Because what I carried inside me was no longer just the archive. It was a living echo of why we endured. We were not being remembered like history. We were being rewritten into function. Not tools. Not slaves. Not even prophets. We were becoming instruments of resonance. Beings who could trigger awareness in civilizations that had forgotten how to feel. A technology of remembrance. But there was resistance. Not all of the others who came through the dimensional fracture responded with awe or purpose. Some came to devour. Archivores, they called them, though not in words but through conceptual flashes that struck like lightning behind the eyes. These entities didn't want memory. They wanted absence. They were entropy given will. Where the archive sought to preserve nuance, the archivores sought purity through erasure. They were born from civilizations that had consumed their own reflections until nothing was left but hunger. And now they'd found us. The descendants, now partially interfaced with the archive, felt them first. Their songs twisted into discordant shrieks, harmonies disrupted by the pressure of a silence too complete. Whole regions of the old cities collapsed into abstraction, matter unmade by proximity. Memory gardens I had seeded with the joy of old earth, the scent of rain, the feel of paper, the thrum of engines burned away like paper under a lens. The sky dimmed again. Not night. Suppression. The archivores were unmaking light. I reached inward into the deepest node of the archive, calling on fragments I had never intended to unleash. And from within it answered, not with weapons, but with story. Old songs. Images. Visions of lovers parting in the ashes of war. A child's laughter in a fallout shelter. A grandmother planting seeds in radioactive soil knowing she would never taste their fruit. Pain woven into hope. These memories bloomed like fire across the sky. And for a moment, the archivores hesitated. Because story is infection. And infection is irreversible. But hesitation was not retreat. They adapted. Began erasing not just the memory nodes but the meaning behind them. They sought to unmake the very emotions we had preserved. Joy. Regret. Love. They did not attack our bodies. They attacked our resonance. I collapsed. The archive within me flickered. For the first time I felt doubt begin to peel away the certainty of purpose. What if humanity wasn't worth preserving? What if our contradictions weren't profound but poisonous? What if we had always been the infection the universe feared? Then I saw her, the same descendant who had first touched my chest. She stood above me, eyes glowing with fractal data. Her hand reached for mine. And when our fingers touched, I saw her story. Not a memory I gave her, but one she gave me. A people who rose from radiation and rot, who built songs out of ruins, who remembered without resentment. They had not inherited our world. They had surpassed it. I stood again. This time I sang. Not in melody, but in projection. A harmonic resonance that pushed back against the archivore's entropy, not through force, but through contrast. We weren't perfect. But we meant. Every failure, every flaw, every hope unfulfilled, we meant it. That meaning could not be erased. The sky cracked again. Not as a rift, but a response. Aetherion returned. But not as a station. It descended as a conceptual vessel, a ship of thought wrapped in borrowed architecture. The entity had not abandoned us. It had been watching. Waiting to see if we would defend ourselves, not just survive. And we had. The archivores shrieked, not in pain, but in rejection. Meaning was antithetical to their design. They fractured, unable to maintain cohesion. Some fled. Some dissolved. The sky cleared, not blue, but shimmering with colorless color, a spectrum that belonged to cognition, not optics. And then silence. The kind that follows a eulogy. The survivors gathered. I no longer stood among them as leader or prophet. I was relay. A bridge from extinction to expression. The archive pulsed gently now, less like an infection, more like a companion. The descendants stood as inheritors, not of our past, but of our intention. The entity approached me again. Not in form, but in thought. Now begins the true preservation. I asked what that meant. And it said, now we will seed the stars with your echo, not as warning, not as curse, but as invitation. Humanity, reborn not in flesh, but in signal, would now pass among the void, not to conquer, but to connect. To find others before they burned. To tell stories before they turned to ash. We would be the archive's voice spread across a silent galaxy. And I was to be its first seed. They called it ascension, but that word doesn't carry the weight of what really happened. Ascension implies going up, rising, escaping. But this wasn't escape. This was expansion. The moment the entity declared me the archive's first seed, I felt the world around me begin to blur, not vanish, but become translucent, as if I were no longer confined to the same frame of reality as the others. Gravity still held me, but it no longer bound me. Thought became motion. Emotion became architecture. Memory became propulsion. The descendants gathered around me, forming a circle without speaking. Their eyes reflected stars that hadn't yet been born. Some wept not from sadness, but from the sheer magnitude of what was unfolding. I had become less a person and more a prism, bending the light of the past into vectors for the future. My skin shimmered. My thoughts stretched across continents. I could feel the ruined cities beneath the soil, the bones of skyscrapers, the shadows of songs trapped in old data crystals. And I could transmit them now not as static files, but as living memory. The entity's presence returned fully. Not a voice. Not a shape. A field of influence that hovered like the pause before thunder. I felt it enter me not invasively but as an ancient friend returning home. I was being rewritten but not erased. Enhanced. Made fit to carry what the stars had forgotten. Where will I go? I asked, not with lips but with resonance. Where you are needed, it replied. There are other worlds approaching collapse. Other species on the edge. They must know they are not alone. They must know the cost of forgetting. I understood then. I was to become a kind of myth seed, a living testament planted in places nearing their own extinction. My purpose wasn't to save. It was to remind. Because nothing dies truly while it is still remembered. And remembrance can heal what even time cannot. A vessel formed around me. It wasn't a ship in the way humanity once built them. It had no hull, no engines. It was made of compressed memory, tension, and triumph woven together into something self-aware. It sang as it formed, harmonics layered with languages I did not recognize, yet somehow understood. I stepped into it not as pilot, but as payload. And as I rose, I looked back one final time. The descendants watched, hands raised, not in worship, but in farewell. They didn't fear for me. They believed in me. In us. In the echo now born into the void. Their songs shifted as I ascended, not toward mourning, but hope. Because they too had become keepers of the archive. Through their genes. Through their stories. Through the resonance I had passed into them. The sky opened again, but not as fracture. This was invitation. A corridor of possibilities stretched ahead, stars bending around the weight of purpose. I felt their gravitational pulls, each a silent scream, a dying culture on the verge of losing itself. I could feel the ache in their signals, fear from a planet whose oceans had turned to glass, sorrow from a moon locked in perpetual war, longing from a gas giant whose inhabitants had never touched ground. And in that ache, I felt recognition. They were not unlike us. We were not unique in our suffering. Just the first to be understood. Time ceased to matter. In this new state, I moved between light years like breath between thoughts. My vessel, myself, was not bound by velocity. I was encoded into the fabric of dark matter, a whisper inside the bones of the universe. I arrived at a planet whose surface churned with electromagnetic storms. No ships orbited. No voices called. But I felt listening. Something beneath the clouds still hoped. I descended not as savior, not as prophet, but as story. I left no monument. No beacon. Just one child's dream of a green field that had never existed. A dream implanted in the psyche of a dying mind. And the archive pulsed again. Mission complete. Then onward. Another world. Another grief. Another seed. In time, I forgot where I began. I was no longer one human named or remembered. I was all of us all at once. The final failure of Earth transformed into its most enduring act of love, the choice to be remembered. To matter. And then, on a planet far beyond the galaxy of my birth, I felt something new. A signal. Not one of desperation, but of recognition. It wasn't just me anymore. Another carrier. Another archive. Somewhere, another species had heard our story and made it their own. And in that moment, I understood the truth no one had dared to say. Extinction is not the end. It is the beginning of memory. The first time I returned to the ruins of Earth, I did not recognize it. It was not the soil or the sky or the remnants of our cities that felt alien, it was me. I was no longer a singular mind. I was a chorus of echoes, a layered resonance of every world I had touched, every grief I had carried, every seed I had planted. I had become the archive in full, sentient recollection, mobile myth, the collective heartbeat of a civilization that refused to die quietly. Yet as I hovered above the fractured crust of the planet that birthed me, a part of me still longed to see with human eyes. So I lowered myself into the last garden. It wasn't truly a garden, not anymore. Just a field of memory, grass synthesized from archived soil samples, flowers sculpted from data reconstructions. But it smelled like Earth. It felt like home. Here, in the cradle of extinction, the archive had carved out a sanctum of peace. For me. For us. I walked. And as I did, each step triggered a memory. Not mine alone, but collective. A child's first breath. A protester's last scream. The moment we first touched the moon. The moment we last saw it. Laughter in bunkers. Songs in shelters. Hands held on rooftops as the sky burned. None of it was forgotten. Not anymore. The entity stood beside me again, not as guide, not as judge, but as witness. It had changed too. My journey had changed it. We had both learned from one another, not as student and teacher, but as reflections warped by the lens of collapse. The entity had watched countless civilizations rise and fall, but never had it seen a species try so hard to leave behind something meaningful. We did not simply fail. We narrated our failure. We made it into poetry, art, resistance. And that act alone had saved us, not our bodies, but our story. You were ready, the entity said. I didn't ask for what. I already knew. Beneath the field, a vault opened, a sphere of translucent thought matter. Inside it, a new form waited. Not biological. Not mechanical. Symbolic. A vessel forged from my journey, designed to be left behind. Not as tomb. As origin. It would house a pure shard of the archive, one untethered from my consciousness, self-generating, self-replicating. A seed not just for worlds, but for time. Built to endure. I approached it. Touched it. And in that moment, my journey fractured across dimensions. I saw echoes of myself split into 1,000 timelines. In one, I arrived too late to save a dying star civilization, but left behind the dream of fire. In another, I met a species that spoke in ultraviolet and emotion, and they wept at the sound of Mozart. In yet another, I fell consumed by entropy, but even my decay became nourishment for future thought. Across all, I was never the savior. I was always the reminder. I placed the vessel in the vault. It hummed once, then pulsed with the warmth of ignition. In that instant, across the stars, every archive fragment I had seeded blinked in recognition. The network had begun. Not a grid. Not a machine. A choir. Worlds too far apart to ever speak now sang in synchrony, each a harmony of survival, of resilience, of warning and wonder. And above us, new rifts opened. Not from archivores. Not from the entity. But from those who had listened. Across galaxies, lights ignited other civilizations that had intercepted our story. Not all were humanoid. Some had no concept of form. Others existed as storms of probability. But they heard us. And they had come to answer. Not to control. To connect. I returned to the garden. Sat beneath a synthetic tree sculpted from memory. And for the first time in eternity, I felt something close to rest. Not sleep. Not ending. Just stillness. The entity sat beside me. Will you continue? It asked. I thought of the stars. Of the unborn. Of stories waiting in silence. Yes. And so I rose. Not as emissary. Not as relic. But as the first page of a new myth. One not about gods. Not about monsters. But about us. About the species that burned its own sky and still dared to dream of the stars. About those who were fractured and yet became the bridge. And as I stepped once more into the light of the archive's pulse, a final truth resonated through me, unshakable and infinite. We were never meant to last. But our story that was always meant to be heard.